So let's jump right in and talk about the first speech in the round, the 1AC. The affirmative always gets to go first because the affirmative has the burden of proof. Here's why. Let's say I'm suing you for a breach of contract. In a court of law, I have the burden of proof. I am logically and legally required to speak first to demonstrate that a contract existed and to prove that you broke that contract. I have to prove something exists before you prove that it does not. It wouldn't make sense to make you go first and prove that a contract doesn't exist. How do you prove that something doesn't exist unless you first prove you have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that it does exist? In other words, the burden of proof is on the affirmative team, so the affirmative goes first. We call this first speech the first affirmative constructive. In the debate world, this is informally known as the 1AC. It's a constructive speech and it lasts 8 minutes. The 1AC is considered the easiest speech because the entire speech is pre-written. You don't have to do any thinking, you just have to read for 8 minutes. During this first speech, the affirmative team will attempt to prove 3 things. First, the affirmative team will try to prove that there's something wrong in the status quo. Let's say, for example, that the current use of warrantless wiretaps by the federal government is harmful to innocent Americans because they make us feel like we are living in a police state, increasing our mistrust of the government, and they make us less likely to cooperate with government monitoring. The second thing the affirmative team will do is provide a plan intended to solve the problem. The plan can be expressed in a couple of sentences. The plan might be as simple as, the federal government shall end the use of warrantless wiretaps. Finally, the affirmative team will try to demonstrate all of the advantages of the affirmative plan. Not only should the advantages to the plan include solving all of the problems identified in the status quo, the advantages to this plan could also include increased liberty, improved relations with other countries, and an overall increase in the people's trust of their government. So here's a quick review of the 1AC. Here's the problem, here's the solution, here's what life looks like once the solution is implemented. After the 1AC is finished, the first affirmative speaker doesn't sit down. He or she remains in the front of the room and waits to be cross-examined. You can probably guess that the next speaker is the first negative constructive. So while he or she is preparing his or her speech, the second negative speaker comes up and cross-examines the first affirmative speaker for 3 minutes. Incidentally, the first negative speaker really wants his or her partner to take the full 3 minutes so that he or she has more time to prepare. The next speech is the first negative, who gives the first negative constructive, or the 1NC. Just as the affirmative team has the burden of proof, in which they must prove that there is a problem in the status quo and that their plan will solve the problem, the negative team has the burden of clash, or rejoinder, which means they must present arguments to disprove the opposing team's arguments. In this 8-minute speech, the negative team will try to tear apart all the affirmative arguments and introduce some new arguments as well. Just as basketball team has offense and defense, so do debate teams. Each team is trying to add arguments to their side of the scale to tip the scale in their favor. Defensive arguments remove arguments from your opponent's side, while offensive arguments add weight to your side. So let's take a look at that affirmative plan again and see what we can do with offense and defense. Remember that the affirmative team claimed that warrantless wiretaps were causing a variety of problems, so they proposed a plan to end the use of warrantless wiretaps. Not only did they claim their plan solved for living in a police state, increased mistrust of the government, and a decreased cooperation with government monitoring, they also said that the affirmative plan increased liberty, improved relations with other countries, and restored people's trust of the Constitution. The negative team, in response, should have some defensive arguments, which might include trying to prove either that government surveillance isn't bad, or that eliminating warrantless wiretaps doesn't result in any of these advantages. But these arguments don't necessarily tip the scales in favor of the negative. They just reset the scale to where they were before the start of the round, so neither team is really winning at this point. So the negative team needs some offensive arguments as well. These arguments are the type of arguments that prove that the status quo would be worse if we enacted the affirmative plan. Examples might include an increased threat of terrorism, a decreased sense of safety, or an increase in criminal activity. These arguments tip the scale in favor of the negative because they prove that our world would be worse if the judge voted for the affirmative team. Now, before we move on to the next speech, let's introduce one last important concept for the first negative speaker. Since the speech is only 8 minutes long, it's strategically smarter if the negative team makes as many arguments as possible in those 8 minutes. There are really 2 ways to increase the number of arguments you can make. The first strategy is to speak faster, and that's something that varsity teams often do. But as novices, it isn't something that's really recommended for a variety of reasons. So let's look at a second strategy we can use to increase the number of arguments we pack into those 8 minutes. The second strategy is to be efficient and make your arguments clean, concise, and clear. To accomplish this, you need to pre-write your arguments Sunday through Thursday. We call these pre-written arguments shells and front lines. Shells are pre-written arguments that attack your opponent's ideas, and front lines are pre-written arguments that defend your ideas. Whether it's a shell or a front line, it's a pre-written argument with evidence that contains only the basic building blocks of the argument. Because they're pre-written and because they can be as short as possible while still making the full argument, shells and front lines are efficient and organized, and they let you make more arguments. So a prepared 1N can read 5 to 6 shells in 8 minutes. He or she probably wouldn't read too many front lines since the affirmative hasn't yet responded to any negative arguments. Let's look at the arguments the 1NC might have made. They include defending against the arguments made the 1AC and presenting a few new offensive arguments, including an increased threat of terrorism, a decreased sense of safety, or an increase in criminal activity. Knowing that you need to read at least a couple of pieces of evidence for each one, and knowing that each argument might take up to 2 minutes to make, the first negative speaker quickly realizes that there's very little time to waste, and if the 1NC isn't efficient and organized, there won't be time to make all the arguments. So, that's the first negative constructive. And before the 1N has a seat, the 1A will come up to the front of the room and cross-examine the 1N for 3 minutes while the 2A prepares his or her speech. The second affirmative speaker now has some real work to do in the second affirmative constructive, or the 2AC. The second affirmative speaker now has to read front lines or respond to all the different arguments made by the 1NC. The good news is that the affirmative team got to decide what today's round was going to be about. In this case, it's warrantless wiretaps. So because the affirmative team has really studied the impact of wiretaps, most of the negative arguments shouldn't be too surprising to the affirmative. So the affirmative should be prepared with lots of front lines. More importantly, if the negative team only made 2 or 3 arguments because they took too long and they weren't organized, a good affirmative team can use their front lines to immediately neutralize the negative arguments and spend the rest of the speech telling the judge how wonderful the affirmative plan is, which is something the negative team does not want the judge to hear. So the 2AC needs to restore all of the original affirmative arguments by defending against the negative responses made in the 1NC and defend against all the new offensive arguments made in the 1NC. That's a lot of work, and even though the affirmative team should be experts in the area of warrantless wiretaps, 8 minutes is not a lot of time to get through all of the arguments. Now the 1N cross-examines the 2A while the 2N prepares his or her constructive. Next is where the debate really begins to happen, because next we have the negative block. The negative block is made up of the 8-minute second negative constructive and a 5-minute first negative rebuttal. There is a cross-examination after the 2NC where the second affirmative gets to cross-examine the 2N, but except for the cross-ex, it's 13 minutes of negative speaking time uninterrupted. But here's the basic idea. You and your partner need to have a conversation in which you strategically split the arguments so that some of the arguments are discussed in the 2NC and some of the arguments are discussed in the 1NR. Spend more time on the arguments you are winning and less time on your weaker arguments. These arguments include the affirmative arguments to which you need to attack and your own negative arguments that you introduced and now need to defend. Now, looking at our arguments on the board, let's say that the weakest argument for the negative is a decreased sense of safety because the affirmative effectively argued that the safety is a state of mind that may or may not be tied to actual events. That's a pretty good point. So the negative might not want to spend a lot of time rescuing that argument if it isn't winning. But let's say the strongest argument for the negative is the impact of the affirmative plan on the possibility of a terrorist attack. So either the 2NC or the 1NR should be taking a lot more time to really drive that point home and speak at length. The negative team still has to cover all the arguments by the end of the negative block, but by splitting the arguments between them and by giving more time to the arguments they are winning, a good negative team can really do some damage to the affirmative plan in the negative block. Now let's move on to the 1AR. You'll recall that I said earlier that the first affirmative speaker has the easiest speech in the round, the 1AC, because it's all pre-written and there's no thinking to be done, just reading. Well, the 1AR is the hardest speech in the round, and it's also delivered by the first affirmative speaker. Let's take a closer look at why the 1AR is the most challenging speech. You see, the negative team had the luxury of splitting their arguments into 2 different speeches, totally 13 minutes, and a well-prepared negative team will be capable of splitting that block to maximize their analysis in each argument. But in the first affirmative rebuttal, you don't have that luxury. You have to discuss every argument in the debate round, and you only have 5 minutes to do it. More importantly, you need to decide beforehand how much time you're going to allot to each argument so that you can adequately cover all the arguments. There are some key strategies you want to use to make your job a little easier as the 1AR. First, although you have to discuss each argument, you don't have to annihilate each argument by discussing it at length. This isn't the speech to do that. Remember that the negative team essentially just told you which arguments they thought they were winning on based on how much time they spent on each argument, and their strategy helps determine for you which arguments require the most attention. Second, although you need to respond to all their arguments and expend your own arguments, you don't have to spend a lot of time doing so. You need to be efficient and organized, but you can deal with most minor arguments in less than 30 seconds or less, and you can spend more time on bigger arguments as evidence as long as you know in advance what you are going to say. Before we get to the last two speeches, it's time to talk about one of the most important concepts in all of debate: weighing arguments. When we talk about weighing arguments, we mean analyzing two arguments side by side to see which one is more important or which one should weigh more heavily in the judge's mind. For example, if the affirmative team claims that their plan to eliminate wiretaps will increase liberty, and the negative claims that increasing wiretaps will increase terrorism, then the debate comes down to one major question: is it more desirable to be free or safe? Weighing arguments means comparing arguments to see which is more important in the mind of the judge. You should spend a significant amount of time weighing all your arguments to all of the opposing team's arguments. Not only does weighing arguments make things easier for your judge, it makes things easier for you as well, because it lets you summarize lots of complex arguments into a single question, a question that you ask and answer for the judge. The final two speeches of the second negative rebuttal and the second affirmative rebuttal. Although they are very different in what they discuss, they're very similar in structure. There are three purposes for the final speech for each side. First, you need to point out any inadequacies in the previous speech. Did the speaker drop an argument? Are there responses that you think weren't strong enough to be considered effective? Second, the speaker needs to extend and respond to any and all arguments that are still in play. Again, you'll want to know what you are going to say and how long it will take for each argument. Finally, the speaker must take at least a minute to step back and paint the bigger picture in today's round. In a broader sense, what was today's round about? What did we learn? How should the judge cast his or her ballot based on what's most important? Why did your team win the round? Now, by now, you should know the responsibilities for each debater in each speech. These speaker duties are essential in knowing how and when to respond to the arguments. But for now, let's review the major concepts. Speaker duties: plan, advantages, burden of proof, burden of clash or burden of rejoinder, constructive, rebuttal, cross-examination, offensive arguments, defensive arguments, shells, front lines, and splitting the negative block. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.